Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about Akira Kurosawa's book, Something Like an Autobiography, and this was, who translated this book? Who did the work with this guy? I don't remember off the top of my head, but they were instrumental in this effort. Oh yeah, Audie Bach. She did an excellent job in this book. Of both becoming associated with the author and translating his work. And this is kind of categorized as film autobiography. And I'd say it's closer to a memoir than autobiography, because while it's vaguely chronological, it doesn't go into all of the details that you're kind of used to an autobiography. I mean, it's not a huge book. I mean, it's not large. And it's important if you're a fan of Kurosawa's work. And it's, to my mind, important if you are interested in Japanese contemporary history, because Mr. Kurosawa gave me an insight into the Japanese culture prior to World War II that really explained World War II. Now, I have spoken about my love-hate relationship with Japanese culture in the past. There are things about I love it. My username here on YouTube is inspired by a Japanese weapon, but their attitudes towards other people that aren't Japanese are questionable, and their rather rigid social structure that has led to a lot of authoritarian rule is also rather questionable, and Mr. Kurosawa really brought that forward to me in a manner that I've never had it presented before. And I've read the book The Rape of Nanking, which was a great example of what happened when the Japanese were just released unfettered upon Korea. But I never completely understood why. Thanks to Mr. Kurosawa, I have a much better idea. The book covers his early childhood, his earliest memories of being carried on the back of a nurse. In fact, he realized years later that he actually had a memory of being carried on the back of his nurse while she went to the bathroom, which was kind of humorous. His early childhood, because he was rather slight of build and not particularly healthy, in his family's efforts to try to get him to be more of a manly man. And the degree of sexism and discrimination and physical, emotional, and psychic abuse heaped upon anyone in the Japanese culture that did not adhere to this very, very narrow definition of this is where you have to be. And if you don't fit in here, we will darn well hack off any parts of you until you do fit in here. It was heart-wrenching to read his discussions, his memories of his childhood and what happened to him. And it was doubly so because he had completely subsumed these things and never questioned them. At no point does he ever question what happened to him. He just says they're horrible and then moves forward. And this book was written when the man was 70. And at 70, he was still suffering from the trauma that he survived as a third grader. And I'm not being, this is not hyperbole. I know enough about trauma as an experiencer and a person that's read about it and a person that is in cognitive behavior therapy and has been reading about it. This man suffered horrible trauma that he never got over, ever. It scarred him for life and haunted him forever, giving him anxiety to a degree that was heartbreaking. And this book really brought that to light for me in a way that nothing else has. I never understood the experience that he had gone through. He had an older brother commit suicide. He had another brother that died. He had a sister that died when he was living with at the time she died. He just had this long series of tragic events in his life. And the fact that he turned out as good as he did, as relatively balanced as he did, is a testament to his resilience and the resilience of the human soul. But he still had his own personal issues. He was incredibly insightful, at the same time completely oblivious He talked about one point in a film where he'd created the scene, and while writing this book, he realized, oh yeah, I based that scene on something happened to me as a child. Not a small event as a child, a major traumatic event of his childhood, and he was completely unaware of the fact that he had put the same scene into a movie he had directed. That takes a level of self-unawareness that is astounding. I have never encountered anyone in writing show me how they can be insightful on one page and the next page be utterly oblivious. He talks about the strength of his mother, how strong she is. She survived a burn to her hands that were, it was a second, possibly third degree, minor third degree burn. Never said a sound. During the treatment of those wounds, never said a sound. He talks about how strong she is. And then, 3 pages later, he talks about being scarred for his entire life because school-age boys and school-age teachers compared him to a girl. He's just talked about how strong this woman was. About he could not fathom the strength of character that she had to live through this experience and keep going forward. And yet he was then scarred for his entire life because he was compared to a woman. That kind of cognitive dissonance is astounding. And this book is rife with it. It's also rife with the entire history of the Japanese film, from the silent era all the way up through, of course, some of his most famous work. And interestingly, he stops talking about film in basically 1950. Because his reasoning is that he didn't want to talk about it anytime after 1950, because he was still working with the people that were working with him in that era, and he didn't want to burn any bridges. So he talks about his work all the way up through, like the Seven Samurai and that era of film when he made some of his greatest work. But he stops talking about film in that way. And he doesn't really talk a whole lot about his life after that time period in very vague terms. But if you want to know about the early film industry, and you want to know about his life in this early parts of development, this book is a must-read. I think that this is a very important book for anyone that's a film fan, particularly if you're a film student, and if you're interested in Japanese film history. This is a very important book. But it also showed me how, with the incredibly rigid structure of the Japanese culture, that when they were released upon the world as a world power, why they did what they did, why the atrocities that were done by the Japanese on the world happened. And I'm not saying that any other power in that war were not equally guilty of atrocities, but the ones that the Japanese culture committed, the particular types and the manners that they did it, to my mind, was explained a great deal by reading this man's history. Also, there were just some very cognitive, strange things for me. For example, when his brother committed suicide, the family was just told to come pick the body up. They put it into a taxi and took it home. That was just weird. I don't know. I don't think I've ever heard of that before. That was just strange. And the fact that there wasn't the American puritanical view towards sex was refreshing for me. To know that even in the 1930s, there was parts of the world that were not wrapped up with their pearl-clutching, puritanical love of a proper worldview. At the same time, it was an incredibly sexist society. So it was very weird. So it was a glimpse into his social structure, completely alien to me, but also very familiar. So it was an interesting book, thought-provoking. Not a long read, obviously, but definitely well worth your time.